Okay, thanks. I want to go to Angela McKay to talk about one of the very basic questions about this that I've never been quite as clear about as I would like is, like concretely, like what when we're talking about information sharing, what types of information are we talking about needing to be shared, and what specific liabilities? Because I know the 2013 bill, there were concerns that it had this very broad immunity, which made it kind of not clear, which. Presumably the concern is you share information and there's some kind of privacy lawsuit. But it was never clear to me like exactly which kind of lawsuits people were afraid of and what kind of information they wanted to be shared. Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Certainly. And when you talk about the types of information that should be shared, the first thing to think about is not just a list of enumerating different types of information. The first qualifier there should be, what is the type of player set that you're looking to exchange information between? And what are their capabilities to understand things like threats and vulnerabilities and act on threats and vulnerabilities? Because sharing all information with all different player sets does not actually help improve security, actually increases risks. So there are players who have better ability to act on information, and particularly act at scale. So for example, organizations like AT&T and Microsoft are going to be able to both produce, consume, and use information in different ways than my sister who owns a chiropractic small business in Atlanta, Georgia is going to be able to do. So you have to think a little bit about the different players and their need sets. So when you are talking in this space, there is broad sharing for the superset of users, things that really help people understand the nature of threat. You hear things like malware signatures. That is something that will help people protect their own systems. When you think about organizations who have higher capabilities, that is a space where you want to think more about not just the malware signatures, but also heuristics or things that might be the nature of an emerging threat. So what are you seeing as behavior on network that might actually indicate that there's a threat that is occurring? That also then translates to the kind of liability space. We don't believe that blanket liability protections are going to create the kind of right balance and encourage and incentivize the appropriate behaviors in this space. We do think that when you're thinking about liability protection that one, it has to do with the sharing piece that Ari brought up, so liability protection for sharing information. And then another piece that we think about is what are the liability protections for either taking action or not taking action on information received. There's a really sticky point of if I receive something and I didn't take action, what are the implications there? And I think we have to think really carefully about those liability protections and what is going to be the appropriate balance in that space.
So just to try to make this concrete, if you have like a malware signature and you share it with the government or with other companies that might be facing the same malware, what's an example of somebody who might sue you or for doing that or for not doing that where legislation would actually be needed? Because I assume in most cases it's legal to share malware signatures across companies.
So there are, different people have different understanding and perception about what the scope of exceptions are. And so that's really important is, everyone could look at the same series of words and come up with a different understanding of what those exceptions are. The kind of sharing that goes on industry to industry, I think, does not create the same degree of concerns on the privacy and civil liberties front as you have on the industry to government side. But the industry to industry piece does create a series of concerns about, well, are they using this for competitive advantage within a particular industry? Some of the liability protections that you would want in the case of some industry to industry sharing is ensuring that, if you are sharing a malware signature that has to do with a command and control server and locating that command and control server, is that you're not really breaking your existing contracts with customers. And so we do have contractual commitments to customers. We have exceptions inside of that. We do not want to break those contractual commitments. And we don't need liability protection to do that, but that's one of those balance points of we want liability protections, but not so far that we aren't remaining commitments, keeping our commitments to customers.
Okay, but then what's a law you might be breaking? And I'm trying to figure out presumably there is some set of laws that some companies would like to share certain kinds of information except for those laws. And I'm just trying to get a concrete example. Maybe is antitrust one of them? Are you thinking about there being an antitrust lawsuit if there was too much sharing?
There are, and this gets to where I'm not necessarily saying these are a series of Microsoft concerns, but rather the concerns that I hear from different segments in industry and different partners. So antitrust concerns are one. There are regulatory concerns about sharing with government. There's a series of concerns that I hear from different segments of industry that varies. I do think that in particular, when you look at the sharing that goes on within the IT sector and among, for example, organizations like mine and antivirus organizations, we have not found ourselves to be as constrained in this space as I think other sectors who have different regulatory backgrounds.
Okay. Let me go to Siobhan Gorman. Do you have any sense for how, there's been a lot of attacks, probably Sony's the most high-profile one. How has this changed the culture of companies? Are companies paying more attention to these issues than they did a few years ago? And if so, what are they kind of doing to make themselves more secure?
I think that 2014 was certainly a time period that brought this issue to the forefront for a whole range of companies. And I think that the Sony hack was the most high profile and in some ways the most alarming, simply because you had a situation where hackers were able to get into the system and they were actually able to destroy data and obviously also post a lot of embarrassing information, which definitely gets almost any CEO's attention. But what you saw in 2004 was a whole wide range of companies getting hit. So it almost, it conveyed the message that almost any industry sector could end up being a victim of these kinds of, hacking events. And so I do think that it's raised a level of concern. We certainly saw reports out of Davos, I think it was last week, how it was on the minds of almost every CEO there, and that's obviously a very high-level gathering of CEOs. And so I think that now companies are starting to think about, well, what is it that we need to do? What is it that we can do? What are we obligated to do by law? What are we obligated to do just in terms of our commitments to either our customers or investors or our boards? And so I think that what 2014 did was really elevate this issue, and now it really is kind of a CEO and board level discussion. And I think that at this point, companies are trying to figure out which pieces of the cyber problem they need to kind of go after first, because there's also kind of a growing appreciation that this is a pretty wide-ranging set of issues. Not only are you concerned about, potentially people getting inside your system, but you also want to make sure that you are doing sort of the day-to-day internal security maintenance and making sure your employees are educated, which is sort of a different set of challenges and issues that the companies are looking at. So I think that they're starting to take a fairly holistic approach, but it's just the beginning.
So, so you said training employees. What are in specific terms, like hiring more security professionals? Is it adopting different technology? Like what kinds of things are you seeing them do?
I think you're seeing them look at ways that they can upgrade their internal security systems. I mean, one thing that you hear officials in government talk a lot about is, 80% of the cybersecurity incidents could actually be prevented with just sort of proper hygiene of your systems. I do think that companies are looking at that, but also looking at ways to make sure that employees are well educated to help implement those kinds of things, because a lot of the cybersecurity issues that companies run into have a big human component. Humans are being tricked to click on this link or visit this website or something like that, and that ends up being a risk to the company. So you see those kinds of things. You also just sort of see them looking at the notion of getting hacked and that sort of the consequences that follow from that as being much more of a reality, and starting to think about, well, are there ways that we need to protect our data better? What are the actual, proper standards and best practices, and trying to really educate themselves on that. And I think this is across, the financial sector, the retail sector, and in sort of both small and medium-sized companies. It's interesting, even some of the not necessarily Fortune, 100 or even 500 companies that are starting to look at this.
So, Alan Friedland, let me ask you, we were talking before the panel and about to what extent are these attacks even preventable? I mean, it's very easy to say, okay, Sony was hacked, that means they must have terrible security, and that might be true, but it also might just be that the North Korean government or whoever spent a ton of money trying to hack them, and that any company that was targeted like that might have been vulnerable. So how do we tell if a company is actually doing enough? Is there a point at which we've done enough and we just need to accept that these things happen? Or is it reasonable to think we could live in a future where companies are generally invulnerable to these kinds of attacks and these kind of hacks just don't show up so much?
So those of you who are familiar with the economics of risk might know the name Richard Zeckhauser, who famous for saying the optimal number of plane crashes is greater than 0. If we live in a world without security incidents, we have spent far too much on security, and we've probably reached Jonathan Zittrain's nightmare of all just having electronic toasters and nothing else. But it's also important to remember that just because a company has a breach doesn't mean that they failed. They didn't invest enough. Where we are today is, I think, that we have the beginning of market solutions for security. And I think most of us, even those who want a larger role from government, still say ultimately the solution is going to come from the private sector. So the question is then naturally, why isn't the market working? And I think that there are some failures on the supply side, some failures on the demand side. Just very, very briefly, on the demand side, it's unclear what a manager should care about. We know that already managers have a hard time balancing short-term earnings expectations against long-term investment. But even then, the Sony CEO said, we can cover this breach out of our operating budget. And he expressed confidence that his insurance will cover the incident. We will find out whether that's true or not in the coming months. But trying to get the attention of a board, and then even if you do have the attention of senior management, those of you who've been to a security trade show, you wander out onto the floor of RSA or Black Hat, and everyone is willing to sell you the same box that they tried to sell you last year, but this time it's for this year's threat. The thing that used to help you with data breach prevention is now going to help you against APT. Understanding how those pieces fit together is tricky. And so we're sort of left with this situation of what is the first step. I think there is some evidence even that Sony was moving in this direction. They had been previously sanctioned by just about everyone for large amounts of information security failures. So they said, hey, let's bring in managed security provider. This is great. It's the cloud equivalent of security. I don't know enough to bring in the best security people, and frankly, the best security people are way too expensive for me to hire, so I'm going to bring in a vendor who's going to cover my entire solution. That's great. Except they forgot that their internal managers still have to pick up the phone and read the reports every so often. So even something like that still requires an organizational capability.
So the optimal number is greater than 0. I mean, do we know that it actually is it possible that we are actually close to the optimal number of security incidents? I mean, so there's thousands of companies in the country. And I haven't done the numbers, but certainly the fact that there was one very high-profile Sony breach, right. If only one of those happens a year, maybe that's totally fine.
So I think you can look at the nature of the breach and do two things. One, look at the near misses, and then two, look at the less successful breaches. So near misses. Home Depot was hit with an attack. They used the same type of attack as was used against Target. 6 months later, Home Depot wasn't prepared. 2, from what we know, the attackers actually screwed up. They could have compromised every single point of sale terminal in the entire network, and in fact, for some reason, they only went after the self-checkout point of sale terminals. So it could have been a whole lot worse. But also from a recovery mechanism, the CEO of Target got fired. You know what happened to the senior leadership at Home Depot? They got shiny new iPhone 6s, which they talked about because these are more secure. So now let's take a look at Sony versus Sands Corporation. I don't know if anyone's read the report that Business Week put out. If anyone knew that Sands Corporation got hit. So very short version, it actually had a lot of similarities. It's a very strong international relations component. The CEO of Sands, a very uncontroversial figure named Sheldon Adelson, gave a speech suggesting a certain approach to America's policy towards nuclear Iran. And that was not met with applause in Iran. And a month later, someone tried to break into the network. And from what we know about it from public sources, they worked very hard. It was probably related to the foreign actor, but probably wasn't the government. And they were able to do some damage, but it was contained because the structure of the network was built such that you couldn't break everything all at once. And also, the SANS had an on-site team that was able to pull the emergency button, let's take things offline. And as a result, you didn't hear about slot machines spitting out money in the middle of a casino in Macau, and we didn't hear much about it at all. So what we can look and say, listen, there are lots of attacks, but at least they shouldn't be catastrophic attacks. If someone wants to hit you, they'll probably hit you. What you can do is make sure that they don't knock you out forever.
And one thing that the SANS example actually shows is that there can be market forces that create incentives. I mean, casinos have enormous incentive to have very strong cybersecurity because they're obviously handling an awful lot of money. And Sony is handling a lot of things in addition to money and data and things like that. And so I think that does show sort of the way in which incentives can work, and maybe would provide lessons down the line for how to tweak incentives, maybe to have it apply to a broader range of folks in the private sector.
So one related question to that I want to ask Alan about as well is, so companies I think are pretty good at figuring out their own risk and managing it, buying insurance. I mean, hopefully they at least have the right incentive. But they also have cases like the Target and Home Depot breach, where a lot of the cost is customers having their identity stolen, maybe having having to deal with that sort of thing. To what extent are there changes needed to make sure the companies are taking proper account of third parties that are harmed when their networks are hacked?
So I'm going to be slightly controversial and say that third parties are not consumers. We in this country have excellent consumer protection laws. If I wake up and all of the money from my bank account has been sent to Moldova, I get it back up to the FDIC limit. I'm not worried about anyone stealing my credit card ever because I have maximum $50 liability. Where we are starting to see some pushback is whether or not the third parties include banks. And that is a huge area that gets into very arcane contracts that are quite old of understanding where liability lies. And just to give an idea of the complexity, there are different liabilities based on whether the fraud is committed with a swipe or without a swipe. If someone steals my credit card and then just generates a new credit card, which, by the way, anyone with one semester of engineering under the belt can do for about $500 off an eBay purchase, can just make their own credit cards. And so you steal my credit card number, you make an identical credit card, and you swipe it. Well, that the bank pays for. However, if they just use it online, well, then the merchant pays for it. So there are very complex rules, and once we bring in chip and PIN, it's going to get even more complex. And this is, I think, fascinating for those of you who like politics, because these don't hew along traditional political lines. If you remember the fight about swipe fees as part of the debit card swipe fees, thank you. It's basically you have the merchants versus the banks, and someone's going to end up bearing a lot of exposure, and I think it's going to be settled on the Hill.
Chris Boyle, let me ask you about the international dimension of this. A lot of these hacks, the Sony hack, for example, North Korea was suspected. Are there things that need to be done to have countries or companies that work across borders cooperate more across borders in order to address these kinds of attacks?
I certainly think that's the case. I mean, if you look at the Sony attack, it was basically a nation state attacking a private company in the United States. So I think that one of the issues that has to be dealt with, and maybe Ari can speak to this a little bit more, is the idea that, how do we help these companies out? How does the government partner with the private sector in that situation to deal with the attacks? There's an element of, what we saw in response to the Sony situation, I'm kind of blaming the company and saying that, hey, they're a victim as well, as much as anybody else is in that situation. So there's a need, I think, for some sort of international pact. And last week there was some reporting in Politico about Chris Painter in the administration at the State Department talking about some new efforts that were going on to kind of create more of an international cooperative pact between some of the countries that are, countries that are willing to do that. And I certainly think that's necessary. Pursuing some of those efforts and going after some of the cyber criminals internationally is something that has to be done, because you can't expect like as folks have been talking about on the panel, I mean, you're not going to get to a point where there's zero attacks. And if you have a determined attacker that's well-funded and comes from a nation state, I think it's likely that you're going to continue to see some of those attacks. So having the proper framework in place to respond is something I think that will be very important.
And what would you want to comment on that?
Yeah, but just going to add in maybe an example here, because earlier you asked for example, and I think this is a good place to demonstrate one, which is, the idea of reciprocity and information sharing, I think, is going to be a really interesting discussion for those of us who operate not only across basic borders, but also are operating on a global basis. A clear example here, and I've seen bills that have done this, which is let's report all vulnerabilities to the government. So then we'll have a big catalog of all the vulnerabilities sitting with governments who sometimes use vulnerabilities not just to protect users, but also to serve and advance other objectives, national security objectives. So if we report all vulnerabilities into governments, so say the US government says that we should do that, and then the British government says that we should do that, and then the Chinese government says that we should do that, and the Indian government says that we should do that. What you've done is you're basically helping weaponize the vulnerability space, because they're all going to call for the same policy, and then you're going to be creating, basically providing information that can help exploit systems. And so as people craft not only information sharing legislation, but also other things in cybersecurity, you do have to think quite a bit about what would happen if another government asked us to do the exact same thing.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that, but I think the concept of having a strategy of how to deal with these incidents and what should we be doing to try to address these situations is something that has to be dealt with at some point.
Oh, it also points to a challenge I think that the government is going to continue to grapple with, and is going to have to at some point find the right balance. The NSA review panel, for example, came out and said that there shouldn't actually be sort of a stockpiling of these kind of vulnerabilities or attack vectors. And the intelligence agencies fought back against that to some extent, because it's taking away a capability that they're seeking. And so there is that tension between national security priorities and sort of cybersecurity priorities that is, I think, every government's going to be struggling with, but certainly the U.S. government will be.
So, I'm skeptical that at least our government is going to be looking for sister-in-law's chiropractic things. Oh, well, she didn't patch this. We can get in this way. But I think there's a very real tension from a governance perspective. Because we want data for two reasons. Well, one, as a researcher, just please give me all your data. So I like as a researcher, I love the Brussels plan to just have every incident be reported. As a policy scholar, I agree, it's a terrible idea. But I think there's a very real tension between transparency to promote better policy, to respond to the information, and transparency as a form of accountability. They're in natural tension, because in one, you're trying to promote people to work together. Whereas in the other one, you're saying, listen, okay, if you do bad things, you're going to pay a cost, so this is going to discourage you from doing bad things. That's great. It works. I'm an economist. I love that. But at the same time, it also means that your organizational posture shifts. And, Chris and Angela's chief counsel now are basically looking over their shoulder every time they're going to talk to someone and do something useful.
I just want to push back on something. I mean, it sounded, Siobhan, like what you were saying was that there's, and I think maybe what Chris was saying too, is that there's this vast stockpile of vulnerabilities that the U.S. government has that we do not disclose. That it could not be further from the truth. The vast majority of vulnerabilities are disclosed to the company, the vendors whose products they are. They apply to, and to the public at large. So I think we have a process for doing that and putting that in place that is actually working quite well at this point. I think there's more that we could do in that space, but I want to dispel this idea that the U.S. government is stockpiling vulnerabilities.
I think we might be conflating issues a little bit too, because where I was going was more around the broader strategy of how do you deal with nation states and foreign actors facilitating cyber attacks in the U.S. and how does the government respond, which I think everybody would agree with. It's something that the policy needs to be dealt with. On the vulnerabilities issue, I mean, I know there's things out there today like the National Vulnerability Database that people have. I know that U.S. CERT publishes vulnerabilities. So from a U.S. perspective, I mean, we work with them all the time. So I don't know if there's anything that's been held back or not. But I think what Angela was speaking about was more some of the laws in Europe about requiring reporting of all these different breaches. So we're kind of getting into the conflating between like vulnerabilities and breaches and different issues in one.
No, I didn't mean to suggest that there was some giant database that the U.S. was kind of tapping into, but there was a recommendation from the NSA review panel that shouldn't happen, and that was, to my knowledge, unless that's changed, that was not a recommendation that the White House adopted. So it suggests that there is a kind of a balancing act that has to take place, and there is sort of an inherent tension between intelligence agencies that need to utilize these tools and the measures that need to be taken in order to protect. And it's always a matter of just trying to figure out how to strike that balance.
I would say we did adopt that recommendation, and we made sure that we reinvigorated the vulnerabilities equities process to make sure that we were disclosing the vast majority of these cases. Now, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why you want to make a vulnerability public the day that you find out about it, right? There's tons of reasons why that might be the case. The biggest being that if you do that, then everyone has to scurry to fix the problem overnight, as we saw with something like Heartbleed, right? You want to be able to give some time in order to do that. Still, I think we can always do better, and I think we will be doing better. But I think there has been some reporting in this space that makes it sound as though the U.S. government is holding back on this. And as you said, I don't think there's been enough said to say that we did actually adopt that recommendation and move the vulnerabilities equity process further.
Schwartz, can you bring the NIST framework into this for people who haven't been following closely? What kinds of things is that framework going to encourage companies to do, and how much progress we've seen?
So this goes to a lot of what everyone was saying about some of the hygiene stuff. So Siobhan was talking about the 80% of things that are out there that we have solutions for today, and that companies can be doing to protect themselves. This is exactly what the NIST framework was created for. I mean, the whole idea of it was that when I talked about our 2011 legislative package, in that was the idea of promoting cybersecurity standards. Through that process, it kind of moved in the Senate in particular to an idea of maybe we should do this in a voluntary way and create voluntary standards. Industry has an incentive enough to implement standards. We just have to put it out there what those are, and they will do it. And our view was that would be a great step in this direction. It's the way we want to move. We don't need law to do that. We can do this without a law. And the president put forward Executive Order 13636, which had two pieces to it. One was making sure that the government was doing a good job giving information to the private sector, and making sure that we were protecting privacy in doing it. And number two was that we were creating this cybersecurity framework, and that the private sector would lead the framework under convening power used by NIST, which NIST has done in many other ways in many other industries. And from all accounts on this, I think pretty much that it has been a big success in terms of the private sector stepping up and working with government entities and working internationally to help to lay out a set of cybersecurity standards that sit in this framework. The framework has 5 areas: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And this goes to exactly what Alan was talking about in terms of, did I get those right?
You got it.
Alan,
We were talking about that before the conference, trying to remember all of them.
Alan, someone in the back. No, Alan was saying before that you're never going to get rid of all. I mean, and I think that it looks at that as a kind of this is kind of an ongoing cycle of ways of addressing the issue, and the NIST framework really puts that in place in a way that can work in a lot of different kinds of sectors. Now, I think we've run into this issue where people say, well, we're not complying with the entire NIST framework. No one complies with every single thing in the NIST framework. The question is, are you using the framework? If you read the framework the way that it's written, it is written to take pieces of it that make sense. What makes sense for a company that has control systems is going to be different than a company that than a retailer, right? And you've got to take the pieces that make sense for your company, do risk management along this process. We've heard from a lot of companies that are now using this, and we've heard from companies that are requiring it of other companies in their contracts. We hear of insurance companies starting to take it on and starting to require it, so that as people buy cyber insurance, that the insurance company knows that they're giving it to someone that is taking responsibility in this space, that sectors are building models around, maturity models and other kind of models around the cybersecurity framework. And that way, for 1 year of existence, it has been a real success already. I think we can do a lot more in the next year. In particular, one of the things that NIST did in putting together the framework was there were a bunch of things that were kind of on the cusp of being standardized, but were not standardized enough to put into the framework. And they created what they're calling a roadmap on that. And the question is, can we move some of these things that are currently in the NIST roadmap to be standardized, and can industry work on that piece of it to move those parts forward? And where do we stand on that today? I think that's really a question for year 2 of the framework.
Yeah, I think, from my perspective, I was integrally involved in the development of the framework and participated in all the various workshops with NIST. And I think the beauty of the framework is the point that Ari pointed out about it being about risk management. The way the framework's supposed to be worked within a company is that the company is, if you look at the parts of the framework that talk about how to use it, it talks about companies kind of identifying their core mission, identifying the risks from a cybersecurity perspective to that mission, and then the framework provides them kind of a roadmap, or what I'll call like a menu of different types of standards in those 5 categories to help them build a plan for mitigating those risks. So it's a constantly evolutionary thing, wherever you can see over time, you'd be continually evaluating what are the risks to my mission and what parts of the framework best apply to dealing with those risks. And to me, that's the right model for cybersecurity. There's, I'll give the administration and NIST credit that they didn't go down the path of just saying, here's a rigid set of standards you should do for cybersecurity, because that probably would be outdated the minute it was published. The attack would change, and then those standards would be something else. So by bringing it down a risk management process, it becomes more of a process that you can build inside a company to deal with the attacks. And I think that's the right way to really deal with something that's always evolving like security. And then I can speak specifically to some of the things that my sector's been doing. So like a lot of the sectors have been implementing the framework or trying to figure out how to use the framework. And so within communications, we have an entity with the FCC called the Communication Security Reliability and Interoperability Council, the CISRIC. And so we've been working for since last summer on how to conform the framework to the communication sector. There's been over 100 individuals involved in that, multiple nonprofits, universities, various government agencies, and we're about to put out a report on March 15th that will talk about the ways that the communication sector anyway is conforming the framework. And it's really advising companies in the communication sector on how, giving them use cases and examples of how they could use the framework to try to protect what we call communications critical infrastructure. So it's an example of what Ari's talking about, how different sectors have kind of embraced the framework and are trying to use it. And I think, out of all the things we've dealt with here in security, it's been a good work product, and I think it's been fairly successful over the last year.
And I might add just one point, just kind of connect something earlier. I asked Siobhan about has the conversation changed in cybersecurity, and she highlighted that there's an executive level conversation that's going on now. I think the framework is actually a really good tool. Cybersecurity historically was thought about as, those technical people over there who are doing stuff, just stay out of my way, go over there. And then you had executives who are like, I don't know exactly what this is, how to allocate my resources. And so the framework has provided a really good translation tool and helped technical folks who typically are in the standard space and are like, this is the control I'm using, have a conversation with executives to say, how well am I doing in identify versus what I feel like I need to do. So, right, it's not a static, we all need to hit a point. It also says, what's my risk tolerance as an organization based on my missions and functions and the threats that I'm facing? And so I just kind of wanted to connect that initial part of the conversation to another value out of the framework.
I want to get the audience in here. They're in the front. Is there a microphone? Yes? No? Okay, go ahead.
So this is a question for Ari. I've been told, and I'm going to word this carefully, Ari. I've been told that there are discussions within the White House and the administration to build on this NIST framework, which, by the way, is great, and I love NIST, so that's a positive. But there are plans, there is discussion underway to pull triggers within the executive orders and within existing laws that would mandate cybersecurity requirements. And this would be coming about 2016 or toward the end of the Obama term. Now, the answer to that question is that true or false? It's, are you aware of these discussions?
Also, when did you stop beating your wife?
Yeah.
I mean, I'll say that is entirely false. I want to make that a categorical statement that is false. We are committed to the voluntary process in this space. We have worked with a lot of industries in this space that have, direct good relationships with their regulators, and we've worked with industries in this space that have terrible relationships with their regulators. And I think we have tried to work with them and come up with solutions that can work in that space and still keep this voluntary. If you want to look at the kind of the ideal way that regulated industries can work in this space, I would look at what the FDA has done, and particularly around medical devices. They put out voluntary guidance in this space that really spells out what a medical device manufacturer could do to use the framework in a way that addresses some of these concerns without tying it to any kind of very strict regulatory standards in the space. And we've heard really positive things from medical manufacturers around this. So that's the type of thing that we are promoting and we are trying to get out there. And it's up to the independent regulators to kind of do what they're going to do. We don't have oversight on that, and the ability to.
So all those regulators
Have
that were asking the
we promote
EO
voluntary.
to come back to you if they needed additional regulatory authority to implement all the cybersecurity stuff. All of those regulators that came back to the White House, are they asking for more regulatory authority? Can we expect more regulatory authority from agencies?
We stated publicly, and Michael Daniel put out a blog post on this. You can go back and read. We received no one that said that they need additional authorities. No regulator said that they do.
But I think that's, just to add to that question, I think from at least from my perspective, there's still a concern, right, on the industry side that the framework could be taken out of context. I think Ari's right. The administration has been very much on record that it's a voluntary program. They've said all the right things about that. You can't control what independent agencies do, so I still think that's a concern that's out there. But what we've seen so far has not been that. So we'll see what happens over time. But it is an ongoing issue.
Uh-oh, he's roving.
This is truly a moderating.
This is, wow, fantastic.
Phil
Thanks,
Donahue
Tim.
over here.
Hi, Kevin Bankston, New America's Open Technology Institute. This is a question for Ari, but also for the entire panel. First off, thanks for bringing up and discussing the issue of vulnerabilities, equities, and the stockpiling or lack thereof of vulnerabilities in the government. I wanted to raise a related issue around the growing private marketplace for vulnerability information. There are people who discover and then sell vulnerabilities, often to people other than the vendors who could patch those vulnerabilities, and instead to those who could exploit them. The question is, for the entire panel, what do you think is the appropriate role of government in participating in or not participating in or regulating such markets? Noting that some people like Dan Geer at In-Q-Tel have said, the US should actually corner the market and buy up everything and then disclose it to the vendors and drive up the price, while others would say that the US government participating in the market at all is not a morally acceptable thing to do. And then more directly to Ari, is there any position in the government right now in terms of policy around how you deal with this market?
So this has been a question in the economics InfoSec world for almost 2 decades now. And in fact, actually, if anything, we're now back to where we started. When I started thinking about this question, it was assume you're a good-hearted security researcher who just wants to make the internet safe. Should you announce it publicly, or should you disclose it privately to the vendor? Angela may have some opinions on that. But I think the problem is there is no single space, even for similar types of vulnerabilities. How we should treat something in an industrial control system that's used widely is very different than how we should treat something in a thin client that's according to the piece of cloud software. And then you sort of just add that actually there already are lots of people who are buying it up defensively. There's a huge market. In fact, I would say that the largest marketplace now, from what I know that's publicly discussed, is not governments trying to buy things. It's third-party vendors that want to sell you security that Microsoft can't give you. And that's where if you're looking to make the greatest expected value as a security researcher, that's who you're selling to now.
And I might add just a little bit here. So first of all, there is a philosophical debate in the security community that has been going on for over 20 years around what's the right way to motivate and incentivize behavior towards managing risk. And there are at least 3 schools of thought. There is the, we should tell everyone because it'll make people resource fixing faster. I call, that's the broad disclosure approach. There is an approach that is based on time, which says we'll report to a vendor, but there will be a specific time frame in which a vulnerability should be fixed. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and disclose it publicly and also put out exploit code. So that will then again incentivize behavior. And then there's a third school of thought called coordinated vulnerability disclosure that says we're going to report it to the vendor, and as long as the vendor is keeping in touch with the reporter and letting them know that there are appropriate actions being taken to ultimately address that vulnerability, that they would not go public. I think what's important inside of that is understanding that not all vulnerabilities are created equal, which is something Alan was just kind of alluding to. Whether you're talking about the exploitability of a vulnerability, so how easy is it to access? There was somebody who dropped a Microsoft vulnerability out in the ecosystem, and it made all this news. And you had to have physical access to the machine and authorized credentials to get through the vulnerability. So not saying that that's not serious, but that's very different than something where you could have logical access and no credentials. And also, so there's the exploitability piece, and the second piece is the consequence associated with the vulnerability. Again, not all vulnerabilities are going to have the same impact to systems. And so you have to think about both of those when you think about this process. From a Microsoft point of view, we also do not typically have what you call the typical bug bounties, where you're going and paying for vulnerabilities to come to you. There's 2 things that we have done. First of all, we have incentivized and have a bounty program for security researchers to give us mitigations to classes of vulnerabilities. So we're really trying to incent, don't just go and find vulns, but use your creativity to come up with ways to mitigate against vulns. That's one thing. And then the second thing is also providing a window when a product is in beta and saying, hey, it's not broadly out there yet, it's not broadly being used. So if you can report vulnerabilities to us during this beta window, we're going to do as much fixing in that as possible. But once we move into the product being out, we would not be paying for vulnerabilities being reported to us. It's a very philosophical argument at this point, and I think just kind of getting into the role of government question. First of all, almost all governments are already in this marketplace in one way, shape, or form or the other. Whether it's directly or through some of their defense industrial-based vendors, not just here domestically, but internationally. And I think you really have to go into game theory and play this out a pretty long way before you can come up with a solid answer on the right thing to do.
I got a question related to the IPv6. In order to support the future growth of Internet, especially when we need to support the innovations and technologies related to Internet, such as Internet of Things, we have to adopt, as a global community, the IPv6. And even though not everybody on the panel may totally agree with that, but the reality is, in order to make IoT a reality, IPv6 has to be adopted globally. So the question to the panel is, while we are struggling on a daily basis dealing with the security-related breaches and attacks on the on the IPv4 stack, and how can we, as a community, deal with the additional security threat and attack from the IPv6? And what will be the policies and how the vendors, particularly in the private sectors, to help to move that global adoption becomes a reality? Thank you.
Want to take a crack?
I mean, I can start and say, I definitely agree with you that we have to move to IPv6. That's without question. From an ISP perspective, we are in the midst of migrating our services to v6 now. We've been doing quite a bit of an effort. We've had a program office for several years, dating back to like 2009 or 2008, that was kind of managing our migration of our network to v6. So it's going to happen. That's without question. And it certainly is relevant for the Internet of Things. I mean, the more devices that you have connected to the Internet, the more IP addresses you need. So obviously, you're going to need more. You're going to have to go to v6 to support that in the long run. From a security perspective, I think the thing that worries me the most about IoT is that you just have so many devices. So like today, it's easier to manage the less devices you have. So the more devices you put on the internet, the harder it's going to be to manage security. And the model for security for a long time was kind of a perimeter defense. So you put the security at the perimeter, you put antivirus on your device, and that's how you do protection. And I think in the long run, with IoT, you're going to have to shift that whole mindset where the security is no longer on the perimeter, but so you basically put security in the network. And if my chief security officer was here, what he's been talking a lot about recently has been the whole concept of security in the cloud and this idea of virtualized security. So if you move to an environment where, if you move to a long-term environment where you have devices out in the field and they're communicating with virtualized instances in the cloud, you can create security that wraps around the virtualized instances. So it's a true model of virtualization. And so then if there's an attack, what happens is that you only have access into that one particular instance, but you have the security layer around each one of these different instances. So it makes it easier to recover. It's much more resilient. And if you get into one of these particular elements, you only have access to that particular element. The rest of the network is basically protected still, so it's more of like a distributed model for security, not too unlike how some of the attackers build their botnets. So if you go down that path, that's really the long-term evolution, I think, of security and the way these services are going to work. So I don't know if it's necessarily V6, like flaws with V6 per se that you're asking about, but I think in the long run there is a need for V6 certainly, and I think in terms of security, it's going to shift more to the network level and into the cloud, and some of these newer technologies are going to be the way we're going to have to deal with that issue. But that's a 5 to 10 year, to me, that's a long-term evolutionary issue as we move down the IoT path.
So I think just very, very quickly, there are three things going on that make IPv6 different. So you've got your switches, your network applications, and then your number of devices. So from the switches, net flow data and data analysis is currently optimized for an IPv4 environment. So we really have to turn to the CERT community and say, listen, do better, come up with better tools for network analytics that are optimized around IPv6. It's a very technical question. From a network application perspective, I'd much rather have everything flow through my NAT than have everything be globally addressable, right? The nice thing about sort of the current IPv4 is everything's already flowing through a local box. So I can do my packet inspection, I can do all my security in one nice chunk. Why would I want to have a more decentralized network that IPv6 enables from a security perspective? It's a more concentrated security posture. And that gets to the number of devices. Why would I want a whole bunch of globally addressable things in my factory? I'd much rather have everything talking to the local switch so I can control it. Because that way no one can actually talk to it without going through my network as opposed to somehow routing around it.
All right, I want to see, do you want to say anything about Kevin's previous question about government purchasing vulnerabilities or regulating that market?
So I have a totally unsatisfying answer to that question, which is that I don't think that we have a policy, but I'm not 100% positive. So, I mean, I will take it back and find out and respond to Kevin directly. But for everyone else, I mean, I think that's something that the whole discussion that was had over here about the vulnerabilities disclosure process, both in the private sector and with the government, and researchers' involvement in that, and how vendors respond, is something that we are having, is an extremely important discussion that we've been having on a regular basis with a lot of different parts of a lot of different agencies, and it's something that I think you can expect to hear a lot more about from us in the near future. So.
Thanks for taking my question. Yeah, so my question has to do with the end users themselves. I think a lot of the conversation today has been about government policy, about industry best practices, and I think you haven't really said much about what's the plan for citizen engagement and awareness. How do we educate the public? I think it's worth pointing out that the internet is the least trusted sector of our economy, if you believe the Ponemon data. So I think ultimately, if the proposals and the policies don't actually address the underlying lack of trust that consumers have, and they continue to be the source of identity theft, breach notices, media reports, et cetera, I wonder about whether you have the right policy agenda. So any comment on is there a plan to actually engage our citizenry on the importance of these issues?
Can we talk to that? Yeah, why don't you go first? So that's something that's actually been going on for quite a while now. There's So in full disclosure, I serve on the board of an organization called the National Cybersecurity Alliance, which is an organization that consists of, ironically enough, Microsoft and AT&T, and a few others that are not here. But that group, I see Rudy here from Comcast, so they're a member as well. So it's an organization that's whole mission is to educate the public on cybersecurity issues. It's really it's intended to develop what I would call the Smokey the Bear type of campaign for security. So it's really to raise awareness amongst the general populace at large. What the importance of cybersecurity. It talks about how cybersecurity is a what is it? What do we usually call it? It's a it's not just about you, but it's also about everybody else. So your actions as a end user affect your friends and your neighbors and everyone else on security. So it's a collective effort, and they've been doing. They have a campaign called the Stop Think Connect. I don't know if anybody in the audience has heard of it, but it's been going on for quite a while. We launched that in 2009, and it's really focused on raising awareness on security. They run the National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which is every October. That's partnered with DHS, and the big focus of that is Stop Think Connect, and they also do Data Privacy Day, which is actually coming up tomorrow.
So let me add, we also, the administration has requested money for the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education basically every year of our existence in every budget, and this is the first year in FY15 where that's actually being funded. So I feel like we're moving in a good direction there in terms of building that. Of course, a lot of that has to do also with training workforce too, which is a huge issue in this space. I like to point out that we have negative unemployment for cybersecurity right now, and if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics data on this. So that's a key point to that, but it's also educating the public as well and working in that space too.
Just a couple points. One, I think, again, kind of the overall salience of the issue is significantly higher now than it was a year ago. And I think that while that's true, that sort of raises awareness for people in companies that might not have been focusing on it. I think that that's also true for the public, but it's going to take much longer for it to filter out just to the average public person, because again, the incentives there are a little bit different, as we discussed before. I mean, having your identity stolen obviously isn't something that people are seeking out, but even that we're kind of now seeing happen on a not infrequent basis. And so it's going to be a matter of time, I think, for the public to kind of absorb that there are things that every computer user can do in order to try to reduce the chances, at least, of that happening. And to just reiterate Ari's point, I do think that there is a much higher awareness within companies these days of the importance of educating their workforce to the degree that they can about the kinds of security risks that they can help reduce. And companies have a strong incentive to do that just because they're trying to reduce their own vulnerabilities.
That's actually a big component of the October efforts. Like a lot of companies will do internal, and I know AT&T does this every October. We do a huge effort around engaging our internal employees about security safety, because the end user ultimately is probably the weakest link in the chain. That's usually how a lot of these attacks are facilitated. So we make a pretty concerted effort every year to educate our employees around safe practices, safe computing practices, and that's the mission for the campaign to the general consumer as well. As you pointed out, it's a tough issue because you're trying to get people to pay attention to something, and people have short attention spans, and it's tough to get out there. But it's something that we're actively working on.
I'd also like to point out. I think we're trying to build our policy around getting more things that consumers actually can do to protect themselves, and like chip and PIN cards is a key example of that. We put out this executive order with the goal of getting more readers out there and getting more people with chip cards, so that when a consumer can actually starts requesting it of their bank, they actually can get a chip card, and when they go to the store, they have somewhere to use it, right? So we did that for the federal government, trying to promote this October deadline that's coming up for the liability shift, which will move more merchants to have readers, and we're starting to see more consumers starting to get cards now. So you can start to do more education around that for people to request it and to know what to do with that, and to know that, like, if you have the choice, stick your card into the chip reader part. Don't swipe, right? Those types of things that we can move the discussion more towards ways to educate consumers rather than them not having any choices in this space.
Let me ask, maybe Alan Friedman can take this first. How much difference, so we've got a couple companies on this panel that have probably dozens of full-time security professionals that are worrying about this all the time. Maybe hundreds, I don't know, a large number.
Literally hundreds.
Microsoft Research hires more computer science PhDs than anyone else on the planet.
All right, so many, and then you got like the chiropractic practice in Atlanta who may not even have a full-time IT person, and then sometimes, sure, but when we're like talking about companies securing their networks, you have this huge disparity in both the vulnerability and the capabilities they have, and a framework that Microsoft and AT&T can go out and, obviously I assume the chiropractic practice is not thinking about the NIST framework. And so are there things that policymakers can be doing, or that services available to companies at the kind of low end of that spectrum to help deal with this, or are those companies just going to have to kind of be in the same boat as regular consumers, where you get hacked sometimes and there's nothing you can do about it?
So the challenge at a certain level, security requires cognition, right? It's true at the basic user level. We want to be using our computers for the reason that we want to use them. But security, in order to make a security decision, you actually need to interrupt what you're working on to make a security decision. That's even more true at the organizational level. There are so many more things I should be working on right now other than security. And I didn't used to have to think about security as a small business owner. Now I actually have to. As much as I think your average medium-sized business, we're past the hygiene point, even just doing the SANS top 20 or something, that's not sufficient. Because so there's anyone know who HD Moore is? There's a HD Moore developed Metasploit, which is a toolkit that allows you to do pen testing. But it means that anytime there's an exploit on the internet, it's going to be slotted in. And so there's someone coined the term HD Moore's Law as a response to the famous Moore's Law on the internet, which is if you don't have an information technology program that moves at least as fast as Metasploit, that is to say, every time there's a new vulnerability on the internet, even if it doesn't have a special logo, because the logo ones, those are the really important vulnerabilities, you have to actually make sure that somehow your system is patching. If you don't have that in-house, you need to make sure that you have the organizational capacity that your vendors do. You can't just handle payment in a turnkey, do it once. You should be paying someone to make sure that they're doing this as well. And if you can find someone who has a contract that says they promise to do it, that's even better. But I don't think anyone's offering that kind of contract yet. And if I can just put in one very quick challenge on the workforce side, since we've talked about gender as the unofficial theme of State of the Net this year, as bad as it is in all of computer science, information security is probably 10 times worse. There are a number of different scholarships out there. There are a number of different programs trying to bring more women into the field. But it really is, it's probably the worst part of diversity in all of information technology. So anything that the government can do or companies can do, and a number of companies are doing this, because so much of the practical knowledge is informal. It's done through mentorships, and that's traditionally one of the biggest weak links in computer science education. That's my plug.
I think the short answer on the small and medium business question is really outsourcing the services. I mean, and ultimately, a lot of companies here, and mine and others, offer managed security services that are really targeted for that audience, because you can't expect every mom and pop store out there to have a cybersecurity expert, and they barely, they might have 2-3 people. Their IT guy might be their 18-year-old kid or whoever, right? And so, they expect them to understand all these security issues, and the world that we're in now is just really unrealistic. And so I think ultimately moving towards these managed security solutions that companies can offer them. And I think Alan's right that they still need to know a little bit. They got to be able to ask questions of their supplier to basically, understand what their security posture is. They can't just totally ignore it. But they're much better off leveraging the expertise of some of these services than trying to do it themselves, in my opinion.
Yeah, this actually ties exactly to what I said earlier about different player sets have different needs. If you don't understand cyber threats, just pushing a bunch of malware signatures out to my sister in Atlanta is not necessarily going to help her a lot. What you can help her do is understand the nature of the threat, give her a 20-page framework document and say, hey, you should probably talk with your vendor about if you're doing these things.
All right, go ahead.
One small thing, at least in terms of medium-sized businesses, one thing that I've seen of late is at least medium-sized businesses starting to realize that they need to at least know enough to start asking questions, and I think that that's a relatively recent trend. And so it suggests at least an awareness that even people who don't feel that security is their primary responsibility at a company need to at least be able to start asking some questions to kick the tires a little bit.
I mean, I've heard this from like medium-sized businesses that are extremely technically astute, actually, where they'll say, like, we have 2 or 3 people that do our IT services, and they're completely overwhelmed, and all they're doing is security, right? What can we do? And I get to this question of managed, have you looked into managed services? Have you looked into putting more services into the cloud, even for a medium-sized company? Because really, that's where we've come to at this point for getting to real solutions past just hiring more and more IT.
All right, so we have a privacy panel that I think is supposed to start in 1 minute. So you do a quick bathroom break or whatever, but then come right back here if you want to do privacy.